Now you might say to me, well, wait a second. I thought you were explaining to us how the U.S. is going to become an empire, and you just stressed that Cuba is going to become independent. I mean, I guess it's kind of an informal empire since the Americans can have some influence in Cuban affairs, but that's not a formal empire, and we're talking about how the United States is going to become an empire. Well, that is a fair question, and we're going to go into more detail now to kind of answer that question. So what's key is we have to understand that the Americans understood themselves not simply at war in regards to Cuba, but at war with the complete Spanish Empire, right? We're at war with the Spanish Empire. So, for example, if you look at the map on the right, that would include Puerto Rico, right? That was part of the Spanish Empire. So that is how we're going to seize control over Puerto Rico, right? We will fight the Spanish forces there, and then we will seize Puerto Rico. And we didn't make any promise that Puerto Rico would receive independence. So we will keep that as a spoil of war from Spain. So that's what I mean. The United States here is going to keep that territory. That is still part of in a sense, the United States. And it's not a state, right? So it is kind of an empire, depending on how you define empire. But that's a U.S. Part of the United States that's not a state, right? So that's an example. The example I'm going to focus on, though, is the Philippines, right, which is in the Pacific, because we're already in the United States has already kind of expanded its power into the Americas. I want to focus on the Philippines because it shows how we're expanding our power further into the Pacific, right? And I want to stress that at this time period, the United States is going to go to war with the Spanish Empire, and the Philippines is a part of the Spanish Empire. Now, full disclosure, I have a kind of bias when talking about the Philippines and its relationship with the United States. I have a kind of complex relationship with that history because my wife is from the Philippines. She's from southern Leyte, which is the area where Douglas MacArthur landed after he'd been driven from the Philippines in World War II. She and I are not that old. We weren't alive when that happened. But I just wanted to highlight my wife is from the Philippines. As I mentioned earlier, that means our children, pictured there, are mestizos. So I often think about the Philippines and about the American Empire in the Philippines because, of course, that, in a sense, is one reason we were able to have a relationship. And it's kind of curious, to give you an example, sometimes Americans are kind of shocked that Filipinos can speak English and speak it really well. And the answer why they can is very simple, because it was our colony for 50 years. And it's funny because before it became the American colony for 50 years, it was a Spanish colony for 333 years. So Filipinos say, we spent 333 years in a Spanish convent and 50 years in Hollywood, right? And so it's interesting to me is that, like I said, Americans are sometimes surprised that Filipinos know how to speak English. It's like, well, yes, they do because they were our colony. And so a lot of Americans have kind of forgot this history. So I think it's particularly important to talk about the Philippines, both in terms of its importance in the rise of the American Empire, but just the fact also that it was part of our empire, influenced it, and we influenced them, and people don't seem to realize this anymore. Now, in the Philippines, initially, there were people who wanted independence. This is before the Spanish-American War. And there were people who also just would be happy with reform, who just wanted change, who were content being a part of the Spanish Empire. And to give you an example, the man on the left of those three men there is a man named Jose Rizal. Filipinos to this day are required in college, I believe, to take a course that is solely concerned with Jose Rizal. Very, very important person. Every Filipino town you go to will have a Rizal Street. There are statues to this guy everywhere. He's very important among Filipinos. And this is kind of interesting because he was primarily a reformer. He wasn't so much of an independence activist. He wanted Filipinos to have more rights in the Philippines. He wanted the Spanish to give the Filipinos more kind of say in how the Philippines was run. He kind of wanted autonomy within the Spanish Empire, but not complete independence, as long as the Spanish were willing to reform. So I think that's interesting, right? This guy was a fairly moderate reformer. He wanted the Philippines to become more liberal. He believed in liberalism. And he thought that Spain could help the Philippines become more liberal. Now, his primary activity was writing. He wrote, in particular, novels that were in Spanish, not in Filipino. So he was appealing primarily to educated Filipinos and, of course, to Spanish people. And in these novels, he talks about the need of reform and warns that rebellion will occur if the Spanish do not reform. He doesn't say rebellion would be a good thing. In fact, he presents rebellion as being very bloody and violent. And his basic argument is it would be much better if we were to reform instead of have a rebellion, because then, not many people would die, right? If the Spanish do not reform, there will be a rebellion. A lot of people will die. That would be bad. So his position is really pretty moderate, right? He's not out there trying to call for people to rise up in rebellion. He's not out there committing acts of terrorism or anything like that. He is writing novels in Spanish, warning that if the Spanish do not engage in liberal reforms, if they do not give Filipinos more say within the Spanish Empire, there will be a rebellion that will be bloody. But Rizal, I think it's fairly clear, does not necessarily think rebellion is a good thing. He's not out there calling for rebellion. He's warning that one might happen. The Spanish completely overreact to this. When there is a Filipino rising, they say Rizal must have been part of it, and so they shoot him. Right? They execute this novelist, which is just totally overreacting, because like I said, the guy was a reformer who warned that rebellion might happen if the Spanish were not more lenient and more merciful and more reformist towards the Filipinos. So they shoot him, which leads Filipinos to say, well, wow, if the Spanish are going to be like this, we need to be independent. So in particular, a man named Emilio Aguinaldo, he's pictured on the far right, and I did not mistype that. That guy lived almost to be 100. He will launch a revolution calling for Filipino independence. And at the time of the Spanish-American War, the Filipinos are actually doing quite well. The Filipinos are actually winning the war. The Spanish forces in the Philippines were not as strong as they were in Cuba. Cuba was a much more important colony in terms of wealth. So the Spanish were concentrating on trying to keep Cuba. So the Filipinos were doing much better in the Philippines than the Cubans were in Cuba. And they were actually winning their revolution. It was clear that given time, they would have driven the Spanish out. However, in the middle of this Filipino war for independence, the Americans will intervene, will finish off the Spanish, and then we'll enter into this debate whether we should keep the Philippines or not. Right? There'll be this debate. Should the U.S. keep the Philippines? And I should stress, that's kind of a weird debate in a sense to have, because the Filipinos were fighting for their independence, were on their way to winning independence, and the United States will kind of step in and then say, oh, maybe we should just keep it. Now, there will be a debate in the U.S. Senate over this. Basically, what happens is in the American government, like the president can make treaties, but they have to be approved by the Senate. And there was a debate in the Senate because basically what was happening was the United States was going to get to keep the Philippines according to the treaty we were signing with Spain, and we would basically buy it from the Spanish. So we'd give them some several $1 million in exchange for the Philippines. The Filipinos had not been consulted about this, by the way. So there were some Americans who said we need, in the Senate, right? This is a debate in the Senate, who say we should annex the Philippines. We should take over the Philippines. It will serve our economic interests. It will open up new markets, right? If we're in the Philippines, it makes it much easier to trade with China. And also this will allow us to project power because we can build a military bases at the Philippines, right? So it's in our economic and strategic interests. There's also this idea, hey, we're civilized. These Filipinos are only partly civilized, so we need to extend to them Christian civilization, right? It is our duty as civilized Americans to spread our kind of gospel of liberty and freedom to other people. Now, you might say to yourself, well, I thought most Filipinos were Christians. I mean, Spain is a Catholic country predominantly. Weren't the Filipinos Christian? The answer is most were. There were and are a significant population of Muslims in the Philippines, but the Christians were Catholics, and many Americans did not really recognize Catholics as really being Christian, unfortunately. So that's what they mean, extending Christian civilization. They meant extending Protestant Christian civilization. And there was also this kind of idea, we Americans are as good as Europe, and Europeans have empires, so we might as well have an empire too to prove we're just as good as those Europeans. There were also Americans who were against annexation. They pointed out that the Constitution doesn't really make for an empire. It doesn't really have this kind of mechanism for becoming an empire, so forming an empire would be kind of unconstitutional. Other Americans in the Senate pointed out that this betrayed the U.S. heritage as a former colony that won freedom. right? Aren't these Filipinos just like us? Didn't we just fight for our independence and get it? And they're just fighting for their independence. So how can we just step in and take it away from them? Right? This would betray our heritage. We should be on the side of these weaker countries that want independence. In addition, there was also this fear this would threaten democracy. Democracy is about more equality, and where people govern themselves. But empires are hierarchical. They're not about equality. They're hierarchical, in which the people on top rule the people below them. So if we start acting like an empire and having a kind of hierarchy where people, instead of governing themselves, are governed by others, won't that threaten democracy, which is supposed to be about equality and shared government? Now, I think all three of those things are pretty good arguments against annexation. But another argument against annexation was that we do not want, and I quote, alien people to be part of the United States. In other words, we don't want more non-white people. I mean, this is what it was understood to be in the time period. Alien people, we've got enough people who aren't white. We don't want more. So we don't want this to be part of the United States. And the guy who is in charge of, you may have heard of Carnegie Steel, Andrew Carnegie, he actually wanted to, he knew that in this debate that the Americans were essentially buying the Philippines from Spain. So he actually had enough money that he offered to buy the Philippines so he could let it go free. Not because he necessarily thought the Filipinos should be independent, but because he didn't want these alien non-white people to be part of the United States. Right. So there's kind of three good reasons to avoid, to be against annexation, and one really bad reason, in a sense. Now, as this debate goes on, fighting will actually break out between American and Filipino troops in the Philippines. And because of that, and this is kind of curious how this works, the treaty will be ratified, right? In which the Philippines will be annexed. Basically, the idea is that we don't want to look like we've been driven out by the Filipinos, right? If the fighting would not have broken out, maybe the treaty would have failed and the Philippines would become independent. But because Filipinos and Americans start fighting, there's this sense, oh, we can't just leave now because it would look like we're driven out. So the treaty is ratified. The United States decides to annex the Philippines. And we will very quickly defeat organized Filipino forces, right? We will very quickly defeat organized Filipino forces. Again, our soldiers are better equipped, better disciplined, and are going to quickly defeat the organized Filipino forces. And in response, the Filipinos will shift to a guerrilla war, right? The Filipinos will shift to a guerrilla war. Now, if you look at this picture, you can see that there's American and Filipino soldiers. And if you look at that tree, right, you can see there's a tree. There is a roof, and then to the left of the roof is a tree. Beneath the tree, you can see a Filipino man who has his arms crossed. Remember that guy. So there were there were Filipinos who were working with the Americans in order to help us defeat the Filipinos who were fighting a guerrilla war, right? So you have Americans and Filipinos, in a sense, working together to put down these other Filipinos who are fighting a guerrilla war. Remember I said that one problem with fighting a guerrilla war is you're not sure who's on your side. And you remember that guy I just pointed to who had his arms crossed? He will actually lead a guerrilla attack on American soldiers, right? And you can see it kind of described here. Terrible defeat at hand of Filipinos. Insurgents nearly annihilate company of American soldiers on island of Samar. The Americans are attacked while at breakfast. And you can see it kind of discussing what happened. Basically, what occurred was the Americans were just sitting down, having breakfast, and then the church bells started to ring, and that was a signal for Filipinos to attack the Americans. And some of the Filipinos who attacked were actually men dressed in women's clothing, right? So they were trying to pretend to be harmless civilians, and they used that, as well as working with the Americans, making it look like they were on the side of the Americans. They used that to lull the Americans into a false sense of security, and then attacked the American soldiers, right? That's a perfect example of guerrilla warfare, and you can see this was successful from a purely military perspective. This worked really well at, essentially, killing a large number of Americans. So the Americans will respond in ways similar to what we've seen before with what the Spanish did in Cuba. First of all, there's this very violent response on the island of Samar and the surrounding area. You can see on the right There are Americans doing what's called a kind of water torture to Filipinos to try and force them to give us information on the guerrillas, right? So basically in this, you forced a person to drink a huge amount of water, and then you like sat on their stomach, and this was extremely uncomfortable and painful. I think this is kind of like a primitive form of waterboarding, and this was used to kind of torture people to get information. You can see on the left where there are American soldiers being shown executing Filipino, what are quite clearly boys. And what these are reflecting is, after this kind of massacre of Americans on Samar, the American forces there under this man, this military officer named Smith, he will order the destruction of any males capable of bearing arms. And when one of his men says, well, what is, how do we know what's the age limit? Like, what does it mean capable of bearing arms? And he said, anyone over the age of 10, right? So American soldiers, in response to this brutal guerrilla attack, will also take up very brutal tactics meant to destroy guerrillas, right? Well, if you're going to pretend to be a civilian, we're going to torture you to force you to tell us whether you're really a civilian or not, and to inform us on who are the people who are the insurgents, who are the people we need to get, right? Okay, these civilians are going to act like soldiers, so we're going to treat everyone like a soldier, right? So you can see that in response to this guerrilla warfare, the Americans will start using very violent, very aggressive tactics. And now, one thing I should point out is that the Americans, including General Smith, the guy who gave that order about killing the boys over 10, he is actually going to be court-martialed and punished, as well as other American officers who do these things. They're not punished very severely, though to the Americans' credit, I think they are punished. But the key thing is that, this is the problem that kind of results from, trying to put down an independence movement. And I think it's interesting in a sense that the Americans, we criticize the Spanish for engaging in these very cruel acts to put down a guerrilla war, and then we're going to find ourselves committing similar cruel acts, right, to try and deal with it. Now, like I said, to be fair, Smith is court-martialed and punished, though only lightly, for this action. So Americans, like the Spanish, will also set up concentration camps. Remember how I explained that in the Cuban War for Independence, the Spanish forces, in order to deal with the guerrilla war, would evacuate civilians from a particular area where there was guerrilla activity, and declare anyone in that area must be a combatant and therefore could be executed, could be shot, could be treated like a soldier. We'll do the exact same thing in the Philippines. We will also set up these concentration camps. And just like in Cuba, this will lead to mass deaths. Lots of civilians will die because there's not the infrastructure, there's not the sanitation, there's not the water, there's not the food to support them, right? So it's kind of sad, right? In many ways, Americans went into the Spanish-American War with the best of intentions to help these Cubans, but we can see that the results, once you start doing this, things can get really out of hand, right? No one intended, when we intervened initially, that we would go to the Philippines and kill a large number of civilians there, but that's what happened. And we have to kind of keep that in mind, when we're thinking about war, when we're thinking about foreign policy. It's not enough to have good intent. We also have to think of the results of our actions and what our actions might lead to, right? And this Americans in this time period, for some reason, we kind of consider ourselves exceptional. We consider ourselves different. And so we would do the same kind of things, but expect different results. And that was kind of, as I said, that was unfortunate. And it's something where this is why we need history to help us understand what happens when you take particular actions, right? It's not just our intent that's important. We have to think of the results of our actions.